Hi, everyone. This is Professor Level, and we are moving on into the section of systems, first by looking at states, how they create citizens and non-citizens, and how that creates an immigration system, etc. But first, let's go into what a system is. Looking at specifically social systems and how sociologists define them. So, I've given you a definition of system, a social system that has four parts. First, a pattern network of relationships, a systematic arrangement of interaction, some kind of hierarchy or specifically planned lack of hierarchy, and then norms of behavior, beliefs, and attitudes. So, a pattern network of relationships are it's simply seeing how within a defined system there are the ways that individuals, groups, and institutions are arranged is follows some pattern. It's not just chaos that sometimes these groups are in the network, sometimes they're not, right? There's a arranged pattern of the ways that individuals, groups, and institutions are related to each other. Then there's an arrangement of the interaction between those institutions, groups, and individuals, right? So how an individual connects to other individuals, connects to groups, how groups connect to each other, etc., is follows some kind of systematic arrangement or pattern. Then there is some kind of hierarchy in who gets to make decisions and who has power and who is included in the system, who is excluded. And finally, the norms of behavior. One example of this is the political system of the US. Um, this could also be the national, right, the system of the US as a nation. But we have a pattern network of relationships. So we have in this chart, you see that there are individuals like the enfranchised people, those who can vote. There's the president. There's the people within each of these, all of the legislative people. There's the justices of the court. There's state legislative people. And they are, there's a network with the groups here. Is the House of Representatives as a group? And then institutions. We have Congress, we have the Supreme Court and the state courts. So we have the courts institutions, we have the legislative institutions, and the executive institutions, right? So they are all arranged in some specific and patterned network. This rarely changes. We know how this network is arranged. And then there are guidelines for how people interact, right? There's a systematic way of interacting. Enfranchised people generally vote. Those votes determine who is in who are their legislators, who are their presidents, who are their state legislators and government and governors. Sometimes they will petition or protest or write letters to, right? So there's ways in which they actually engage outside of voting with these groups. And then these arrows also show other ways, systematic arrangements of interactions. So the president is the one who appoints the Supreme Court, appoints his cabinet. Um, the but the Congress has to approve many of those appointments. The Congress sets legislation, which is then approved by the president and the Supreme Court, or at least not vetoed, etc. So there's ways in which these individuals, groups, and institutions interact with each other, and there's a systematic arrangement for that interaction. Then there's a hierarchy clearly here. Who has the veto power? The president of the Supreme Court, but also the Congress has to approve things. So this one's a little interesting in terms of hierarchy, just because there's checks and balances built into this system of all three of these branches supposedly having checks and balances on each other. However, they have power to enforce laws that are then enforced upon the enfranchised people. So there is a power hierarchy here of your average person living in the US is accepting the power of these offices. Um, And then there's a hierarchy of enfranchised people over disenfranchised people. So people who have either had their right to vote taken away, or people who are excluded altogether. So undocumented citizens and whatnot. Then there are norms of behavior, beliefs, and attitudes that are prescribed or adopted within the system. So we can think of in the US, there is a norm of what it means to be a good American. Now, that's debated between parties of different political parties, but there is this idea that you need to be a good American in the US. That America perhaps is the best nation on earth, right? Also, we have created different norms of who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. What political behavior is appropriate is often contested. Right now there's a big debate over that. We have left-wing protests that happened throughout 2020 and 2021, specifically along the lines of Black Lives Matter. And then you had right-wing protests and riots at the Capitol, as well as in various cities. And you see that conservative leaders today, anytime that a concern about the January 6th riot happened, they point to the Black Lives Matter protests to say, well, isn't this similar? So there's right now a contentious debate about what kind of political behavior is appropriate or not. So when we look at a nation, we look as sociologists, one of the things we do is we evaluate how is it a social system, and we have to look at all of these things. We can't just look at um, is it just a group of people who accept rule under a certain person or government. We can't just see it as a group of people with similar heritage or culture. We can't just see it as, but all of these, it's important to recognize all of these that work together, right? Um, and sometimes, right, the systematic arrangement is not just acceptance by people to be ruled, right? So that citizens follow the rules or laws of the nation, but sometimes it's forced by the power of people in power. So they enforce or coerce the interactions. So it's not always just agreed upon. Um, Scholars often think about what are the positive aspects of a nation? Like, what are its roles supposed to be?
So what does a nation do?
Oops, I
So
forgot to mute. I have passed. Anyways, so what does a nation do benefits wise? It generally is seen as three things: providing defense, providing a system for justice, and providing protection for various rights. This obviously changes from nation to nation, right? So in Iceland, for example, they do not have a national defense. In fact, they rely on the North Atlantic trade. No, not that. That's something. But they rely on NATO as their defense, as their national defense. So they actually don't provide their own defense. Um, some places don't really provide a system for justice, and instead the nation is more about providing a system of um, uh, enforcement of obedience, right, or of um, what's the word? Words are escaping me today. Of submission, right? So it all depends on the kind of nation. Um,
so
when we think about nations, we need to think about what like, especially within the hierarchies and the norms and behaviors, what is a right? That's a debate that, within nations and international groups, we define what is a right. Is voting a right or a responsibility? Is housing a right or a privilege? Who is a citizen? Who gets to define themselves as citizens? Who has that power to label people? And because if you have a nation, you have to describe who is in it and who is not, and what happens, what you do with non-citizens. And so all of these are questions that when you are doing a analysis of nations as systems, you have to grapple with of how does a nation deal with many of these questions. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring up is or to review is the Kusakabe and Pearson piece on borderlands and stateless people. As we do this, we're looking at people who intentionally live outside of a specific state. They're trying to avoid citizenship or that kind of like regulation altogether. But doing by looking at how these groups of people avoid the state, we see both the limits of state systems, but also the limits of people and their abilities to escape modern day state systems, right? So we see that the people in this region are kind of in an in between. They're not exactly stateless because they still have IDs, they still have some kind of like state designated category, but they also reject a large part of the rule and authority of the states that surround them. So let's get into it. Um, so we're looking at specifically the border of Burma or Myanmar and Thailand. Um, there is a group of people here where they travel between Myanmar and Thailand and especially they do so on purpose to avoid state control by both of these groups, and they try to find the services that they need or that each country provides. Um, and so they will move between these states depending on what they need. Um,
There's a
so
there's
for
a
Kusakabe and Pearson call being stateless it's a specific category. These are people who do not have citizenship, even though they were born in a specific area, but they reject the authority and the categorization by these states. They're often called hill tribes, and the Thai government specifically has created a specific ID card for them that allows them to retain their stateless identity, but it does restrict their mobility. It determines where they are and are not allowed to move throughout the borderland area, but also within the state. So even if they've rejected that authority, they are still somewhat entwined within the system.
there's a kind of
This is
uh, existence of being
sorry.
so.
Okay,
Now, what
so
is
let's go to two important terms I want you to know. The first is spaces of refusal. These are when everyday or people in everyday acts resist the state by evading or dismissing a state's claim to their power. So it's rejecting kind of that hierarchy. This is when they could either reject, ignore the police, ignore any boundaries, ignore any agencies. Um, so it's not necessarily protesting or confronting the state, but evading and dismissing the state. Now, on the other hand, the state can take some kind of exceptional space. This is the second term. It's spaces where the state suspends legal protections of individuals or groups. So a nation itself creates a exception for its system. We see this in the US in Guantanamo Bay, where it has created a space that legal protections do not apply. And this happens in many countries depending on the circumstances. So in this case, even though it has people being born in its boundaries that the state has claimed, it has created an exceptional space for these hill tribes to exist outside of the state system, even though they're like tangentially intertwined, but they are not defined as citizens. So we have exceptional space and spaces of refusal. Spaces of refusal are the way in which individuals refute a state's ability to govern them, and exceptional space is how the state suspends its legal apparatus for an individual or group. So spaces of refusal bottom up, exceptional spaces top down.
Oh,
So overall, the big argument that Kusakabe and Pearson are making is that migrant borderless people are very intentional about their stateless status, that they use the ability to transport themselves from Myanmar to Thailand, specifically looking for the institutions that are best equipped to help them. So in the Thailand system, they use their health and education, but in the Myanmar system, they find more family support. And they also note that accepting this borderless um, or stateless or citizenshipless reality puts them at risk of um, violence or of abuse from other people. So even though it provides some flexibility, it also comes with a lot of stronger surveillance and less safety.
oh, legal.
So next, we're going to go into legal violence. This is the um, piece by Menjivar and Abrego. Um, we're going to look at what is social construct, how the law is a social construct, and how the law is a part of the national system. So remember, we've talked about the social construction of reality, but it's a social construct itself is an idea or a definition or knowledge that has been created and accepted by people in a society. And so a legal construct is a legal or idea or category that changes the way a state interacts with a person or groups of people. So, as you're reading this or reviewing it, the question is, how is citizenship a legal construct? And how could we might construct citizens in punitive ways or in supportive ways? How is non-citizenship punitive or supportive? Uh, and so when we look at legality as a social hierarchy, we see that if you are legal in the US, that means you have access to certain benefits like welfare, voting rights, property rights, etc. But not having that legal status does not necessarily mean you have to have a negative, like that you have to have punitive measures put on you, simply that you don't have access to the benefits. But various states, and this is in the US, is very common. Not having that citizenship designation not only denies you access to those benefits, but also inputs harmful consequences. So overall, immigration creates a system of stratification that remember we've talked about that in the past. Um, and whether, depending on your access and how the state has determined immigration laws and legal constructs, can affect you negatively or positively. And so, legal violence for Menjifan Abrego is the harmful effects of a law that obstructs or derails immigrants' paths of incorporations into a society.
Now,
So legality is, sorry, I want to go back. So legal violence um, is, we talked about how it is the way in which legal categories are denying people access to incorporating into a society. But it also gives rise to practices that harm a particular social group. So you'll often see legal like debates about legal immigration with the idea that we are protecting rights or trying to protect the social good, but it is done in a way that not just protects that good, but actively does violence or does harm to people outside of that group. And so these authors argue that for contemporary immigrants, legal violence is rooted in a multi-pronged system of laws that promote a climate of insecurity, suffering among individual immigrants and their families. And so to give examples, I have a couple of examples here. First is how we categorize immigrants or how we treat them or uh, label them. So immigration raids often portray immigrants as less than human, that and they are often very violent, and it just we justify maltreatment against immigrants by categorizing them as um, despised outgroups, dangerous, or even inhuman, right? So here are some quotes that are categorizing non-legal immigrants in negative ways or blaming them for their situation, rather than addressing their humanity and trying to find a humane course of action to um, address legal immigration in some way. Second, we can look at how legal or legal systems of immigration create dangerous zones. So from 2014 to 2019, um, this is a conservative estimate of missing of migrant fatalities. It is likely larger than this, but we see that on the U.S. Mexican border in those 5 years, at least 2,200 people have died. Um, Larger, longer range studies have shown that from 2000 to 2014, about 6,000 people have died on the Mexican border. We see that that is much larger in the Middle East, Northern Africa. This is largely that 18, 19,000 death toll is largely from the Syrian refugee crisis, where many of them were trying to flee Syria and were either killed along the way or died in traveling across the sea. So this is another way that legal systems of immigration create violence, is that in these attempts for migration, which are largely trying to either escape a bad situation or improve their lives, that it creates a kind of a borderless space where they, or a exceptional space where they are either killed or suffer from, just systems of deprivation. How does it affect families? We saw during the last 10 years separation of family members, specifically a creating immigration raids to terrorize these people. It has created a system in which non-legal immigrants come here to work, but then because they don't have any legal protections, they are able to be exploited. We also see in education, many people are denied access. There have been an increase of attacks, either verbal or physical, from other classmates. And so all of these are examples of ways in which the legal system has created a violent, um, exceptional space for non-legal citizens. So to conclude, we're going to look at struggles of sovereignty. What happens when you have national systems that are competing for similar people or areas? And this is where you'll listen to this Land podcast. And we're not necessarily going to go in depth into this, but things to think about. If nations are social constructs, um, can any group decide to be a nation, right? Why can't Texas or California as a group of people just vote to be their own nation? Why is there this like uncomfortability about thinking about that? How do international relations operate as social systems? What are the international requirements, uh, like as arrangement of or patterned networks, arrangement of social interactions, a hierarchy, the norms and behaviors? Um, and how did the U.S. government system create hierarchies, categories, and norms of native identity, blood, and land? So think about that as you're listening. It's not the main point, but I wanted to highlight how the nation as a system also interacts with other nations, and there's conflicts there that we have not solved, and that as recently as this year, there has been another Supreme Court case about indigenous sovereignty in the U.S. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions about that. Hopefully that cleared up how to think about nations as a system. But please feel free to reach out if you have other questions and want to discuss more. So best of luck. Thanks.